Player 2s are multiplayer-only characters. Typically, talking about instances where there are games that have some multiplayer functionality, but then they'll give the other player a character or access to a character that you normally don't have when it's single player or normally have to unlock beforehand. Let me explain. The most go-to example people think of the Player 2 is always going to be Luigi from the Super Mario series because of the fact that, oh, he's the character that Player 2 plays as, which was associated as, oh, that's the character little sibling plays, to the point where I believe when making Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, Luigi's Mansion 2 if you're in Europe, they pretty much refer to it as basically being the little sibling, or Luigi Brothers as in the little siblings in arms, because generally the little sibling would be the Player 2, so they would be Luigi. And although there are many jokes, whether it be official jokes or fan jokes about Luigi being this insecure younger sibling, due to the fact that he became a character that was beloved overall and has many fans to this day, even got his own series, Luigi's Mansion. So they're just that great, unless you're my friend Christian, who cheated the system by being a younger sibling, but his older sibling didn't play Mario, so he got to be Mario despite he's a younger sibling, supposed to be Luigi. He cheated the system. How dare you! Resident Evil 5 is a game that people constantly associate Sheva as the Player 2, because while you can unlock a player Sheva in a single player campaign, you have to, like I said, unlock her first, so people associate Chris Redfield as Player 1 and Sheva as Player 2, even if reality, depending on who's host, they could play either or of the two characters, but it's one of those things where Resident Evil 5 still has this dynamic of a Player 2 of sorts, even if reality, you can equally play as both characters and neither of them are permanently locked off to a single player role. Dead Rising franchise is an interesting case of this, where it went Dead Rising 1, which is a single player game, Dead Rising 2 was multiplayer, but they got around it by just having two Chucks, you know, simple thing, simple idea. But then comes in Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, where now the single player character is only Frank West, since it is a non-canon spin-off with Frank West. But Player 2 will then be Chuck. So Chuck is in the game in a playable form, but only if you are the second player put in. And normally this wouldn't be a bigger deal, but it's the fact that both characters have their own different movesets. So I know someone buying Off the Record will be playing it because they want Frank West, but it's interesting they add an entirely different character, entirely different moveset in the form of Chuck as a single player only option. It's one of those things where they could have just replicated having two Frank West, but decided to try and make it more unique for this entry, even if it means that now Player 2 has their own distinct moveset different from Player 1, which honestly a lot would actually prefer something unique like that. But then comes in Dead Rising 2 Case West, where now it is the opposite. Player 1 is always Chuck Green, and Player 2 is always Frank West. And this one irked me because one of the selling points of the game is the fact that Frank West is in a returning role in a Dead Rising game, a mainline title. But you could never play as him unless you were the Player 2, so I had to keep joining random online lobbies, as there is no split screen in Dead Rising series, in order to play as Frank West and his more up-to-date moveset from Dead Rising 1, since I didn't have Off the Record. It's one of those things where it's like, I want to play as Frank West over Chuck Green, but I couldn't because he was exclusively the Player 2 option. I had to join lobbies as Player 2. I couldn't even be host a lobby myself in order to get the experience of playing as Frank West, which is one of those things that bugged me back then because they're both equally the main characters of the story. Why can't I just switch between which one I want? But no, you have to be Player 2, we wanted to play as Frank West. Dead Rising 3 then also tried to make the character more canonical, but still didn't do much in the case of the main character being Nick, but the Player 2 will be Dick. And Dick does have his own unique dialogue when it comes to interacting with the characters and everything, but he really shows up in cutscenes, and there'll be cutscenes he shows up in only for the next cutscene to forget his existence. So they want to have him be more at a character that exists in the story, but only in very specific scenes. Otherwise, Dick pretty much doesn't exist in the story, it just exists to be a more unique player too. Like I said, it is interesting, he has his own different dialogue when it comes to talking with survivors compared to when Nick does it. So it is a very cool idea, but they just didn't do enough to make Dick relevant in the story. So at the end of the day, it is still Nick Ramos' story. He's still the central main character of the game, as opposed to something like Case West, where both Chuck and Frank are equally the main characters of that title. It's one of those things where they tried something more unique, but then didn't really go far enough with it. But I do praise the attempt at trying to make the second player a more unique entity. Another case is Kirby's Dream Land 3, where obviously they want the main character to be Kirby, and therefore the player 1 will always be Kirby. But as an extra option, you also have GUI, who can be controlled either by the CPU or can be controlled by a player 2. Once again, another character that is meant to function similar to Kirby, but they also made him more distinct by how GUI animates and looks compared to Kirby, and something that player 1 doesn't get the option to do. You can't switch roles and have player 2 be Kirby, unless you just switch controllers, but again, that just make player 2 player 1, and not player 2 playing as Kirby and player 1 as GUI. But it's one of those things where here's another character that only that's there for the player 2 option, just to give them something, you know, for multiplayer, but you can't switch the roles, or player 1 can't decide, you know what, I don't feel like playing Kirby in Kirby's Dream Land 3. Let me play as GUI for this experience kind of thing. So it's one of those things where, once again, another playable character that is only relegated to the second player role and not the first player role ever. Halo franchise from its inception always had co-op of some shape or form, with Halo 1 and 2 having both characters be duplicates of the character playing as, with Halo 2 introducing the Arbiter, but when it came to the Arbiter levels, there would just be 2 Arbiters. Master Chief levels, 2 Master Chiefs. Simple thing. Halo 3 decided, hey, we're gonna include Arbiter and Chief together in this adventure. Although they gave Arbiter Jackal in the storyline, unfortunately, and to add more salt to the wound, the player cannot pick the Arbiter. He is a player 2 only character when it comes to Halo 3. Was another one of those things where, at the time, people apparently really hated the Arbiter's inclusion in Halo 2. I don't know, I love the Arbiter, I thought it was cooler than the Chief. But people hated the Arbiter, and so there's no concrete reason why the Arbiter's role was reduced in Halo 3, despite him also being there from the get-go in the storyline. But now he's reduced to only player 2 can play as the Arbiter, and he does add more bits to the world building if the player 2 character is there, but as a result, no, it's just Master Chief as the sole main character of it, despite Arbiter getting just as much of the scene as well, but treated as if he's unimportant, sadly. It's one of those cases where they introduced the idea of 2 separate characters for multiplayer, but then just kind of went, no thanks, and just relegated 1 to player 2 option only, and reduced their role in the narrative, unfortunately. When Stranger Paradise Final Fantasy Origin first came out, player 1 could only play as Jack himself. Single player campaign, you could not swap characters. When it came to the multiplayer mode, then the player 2s and 3s could play as the other party members like Jed, Ash, Neon, Sophia, but from default, you can only play as Jack, a single player character, and that was pretty much because the Soulburst animations were designed with Jack in mind. So even when it came to multiplayer mode, the player 2 and player 3s would have these simplified Soulburst animations, and the Jack player would be the one need to do the big fancier ones on the bosses in order to actually beat the levels. But in a later update, they actually made it so that way player 1 can now be any of the characters by essentially making them skins over Jack, but now they're all rigged to actually do these sort of animations, so in a sense, they did become playable down the road, but when the game first came out, the other party members were only relegated to the Player 2 and Player 3s when it came to the multiplayer mode of Stranger of Paradise. I know, the concept of co-op in Dead Space was despised from its very inception, and also that Dead Space 3 is also despised from its very inception, but Dead Space 3 did include a Player 2 only character in the form of John Carver, but when it came to the story, it basically didn't care about John Carver's existence, especially the fact that you played the game solo, he would basically never show up at all. So it's one of those things that he added in because of the trend of co-op games, so they wanted to have a co-op player, probably mandated by EA, let's be real here, along with microtransactions in that game. But it's one of those things where they did add in a Player 2 only character and tried to make it more distinct by having the things that Isaac and John would see be different, with John seeing hallucinations that the Isaac character would never see. So you have interesting moments between the two where both players are looking at a thing, but what they're seeing is completely different, and is a more unique way of adding in a Player 2 character by trying to add this dynamic that what John sees may not actually be there, and just leaves the Isaac player going, what are you staring at? So it is an interesting idea that I haven't really seen any other game try to do when it came to putting in a Player 2 only character. But like I said, John was just kind of shoved into Dead Space 3 solely for a big back-in-the-box, slap-in-the-back-in-the-box feature of co-op, because otherwise he doesn't really matter when it comes to what's going on in Dead Space 3. The Gears of War franchise, that always had co-op as being a main selling point, but interesting case with this one, despite it, once again, being Player 1's always Marcus, Player 2's always Dom, is the fact that despite Dom being the Player 2, for what I've seen people talk about Gears of War, Dom is the highlight of it though, because people really love Dom's story and character arc, especially throughout the Gears of War trilogy. So despite Dom being relegated as the Player 2, he is not only just as important to the narrative going on as the Player 1's Marcus Phoenix, but in some cases, he outshines him to a point where people like Dom more than they do Marcus, which is a crazy thing that a character who is the Player 2 only character ends up outshining several other characters as well, which is freaking cool to see that Gears of War managed to the Player 2 be this beloved. Like, I know other people I mentioned in this video also became beloved characters, but not to the point where some people would say they outshine the main character and other people in the universe especially. So that's one of those things that's like, way to go freaking Dom. This next example isn't technically Player 2s, but they're multiplayer only characters, being from Bayonetta 2. Where in the main story of Bayonetta 2, the playable characters are Bayonetta, Jean, and Rosa, but if you're playing the online tag climax mode, then you also have access to Baldur and Rodin as playable characters. Something that I always thought was very cool that they were put here, but weren't playable characters in the main story, probably because how the characters are built when they work for stuff like the QTEs, the main story and everything. But it's one of those things that's interesting where Baldur and Rodin can only be played in this multiplayer mode. I wonder if people even remember that it even has multiplayer mode, where it's just the fact that it's like playing it to play as Baldur is just a cool thing to do. But like I said, even though it's technically not a Player 2 only thing, because either player can pick who they want to play as in the multiplayer mode, the fact that it has 2 exclusive characters for it means I'm gonna add it as a multiplayer only thing, even if technically either player could pick to use them, you know? Listen, I know I'm cheating with this entry, but how many people talk about the tag climax mode in Bayonetta 2, okay? Another case of cheating is also Batman Arkham Origins multiplayer mode, where in the main campaign you're just playing as Bruce Wayne / Batman. Sorry if you didn't know Bruce Wayne was Batman. I'm sorry I ruined the mystery. But in the multiplayer mode, you're playing as these thugs for several criminal kingpins, such as you got for Bane's forces, we have also the Joker as well. Well, intervals, people start taking the role of Batman and Robin. Robin isn't even in the main campaign, but the fact they included Robin as one of the two superheroes trying to stop this gang war is an interesting idea, aside from, you know, the whole concept of multiplayer mode, where they actually managed to make a freaking Predator-style mode for Arkham games work in multiplayer that doesn't get enough respect just for the fact that they made the effing thing actually work. It is just a cool thing, once again, technically not a player 2 only thing, but is a multiplayer only feature. We have to play as those characters for it, whether we be playing as the thugs who work for Joker and Bane, or getting to play as Robin in this mode, doing Predator mode stuff and taking out goons. It's just one of those cool ways of trying to add an extra character that, even if they exist for multiplayer, a creative spin on how to include them. So it's just a topic I want to go over because it's just a unique way of doing multiplayer when it comes to trying to make player 1 and player 2 feel distinct, or if a character is too important and they have to be part of the adventure, let's say like Kirby, to be an essential character, so they included Gooey for Dreamland 3, where they didn't want to have two Kirbys, but decided, actually, let's just make this unique character who will function the same, but they just technically be their own distinct character. I also didn't want to include characters like Tails from the Sonic franchise, because I know he's listed as one of the most famous player 2s, but you could play as Tails as player 1 if you just pick a solo Tails campaign. Or I also didn't want to include customizable characters like, let's say, the boss from the Saints Row franchise or Noble 6 from Halo Reach, since technically both players are controlling the same character. It's just how they look is different. So it's one of those things where I don't want to include that because, yes, technically you're both your own distinct version of the character, but you are still Noble 6 and you are still the boss when it comes to Halo Reach and Saints Row respectively. And many games do decide to give you a customizable character to make yourself and the other players stand out. But either way, you're still playing the same character. So I just want to go over the idea of characters who were only playable in a multiplayer mode or only playable as the second player, but still being the most interesting one being John from Dead Space 3, who, yes, I know, is relevant, shoehorned in, but they try to add something unique to it, or someone like Dom from Gears of War, who tends to, afraid to talk about it, outshine Marcus and everything. I mean, based on how I play Gears of War, I'd say Dom outshines Marcus. So it's one of those cool, interesting things where a player 2 only character ends up becoming more popular. Like for me, I like the Arbiter more than Master Chief, but it didn't give him much to do in Halo 3. I just want to talk about, go out there, play games, whether you are the player 2 or the player 1. Don't sell yourself short if you are the player 2, because you're just equally important, and in some cases, may end up getting more love than the player 1 character. Alrighty then, good day.